And I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Christina Fillmore from GSK, who will be talking to us about using R to create end-to-end process predicting delay in recruitment from COVID-19. So Christina, the stage is yours.
Hi everyone, my name is Christina Fillmore and I am a data scientist at GSK, and I'm going to talk to you today, as Viola said, about how we developed an end-to-end process for predicting recruitment delays from COVID-19. So there we go. This work was done as a joint task force, Joint Biostatistics COVID-19 Modeling Task Force. That was a work done between the Statistical Innovation Group here at GSK and the Data Science Group. And so together we were tasked with creating a tool that would allow study teams to help understand the impact of COVID-19 on their recruitment. So to do this, we kind of had to break it down in a couple of different parts. The first step was to predict COVID-19 patterns as a function of time. Without that, we couldn't have done anything else. Then we predicted COVID-19 impact on recruitment across geographies and time. And finally, once we had those predictions, we were able to produce a visualization so that teams would be able to use. So we ended up with a data science workflow that looks something like this. As I said, the first step was to collect information from external sources. So we needed to predict COVID-19 as a function of time. To do this, we got case and death COVID-19 cases and death information from the New York Times and the ECDC, and then we got information about government interventions from the Blavatnik School of Government. So the information about government interventions fall under this category of non-pharmaceutical interventions. So these are the things that you probably know really well now. They're all your lockdown measures. They're your schools closing, your workplaces closing, restrictions on gathering, things like that, that are non-pharmaceutical, i.e. non-vaccine, non-treatment ways of stopping the spread of the virus. So it was pretty clear early on that we could see that these non-pharmaceutical interventions, which here are up here, and the darker gray, the harsher the intervention, had an impact on deaths, and that these government strategies were one of the driving forces behind these daily death figures that we keep seeing. So the problem with these is that they're kind of hard to model. There's 11 different categories, and in each categories there's multiple different levels, so they're kind of a lot of different categorical variables. So instead we decided to look at using the stringency index, which was developed by the Blavatnik School of Government and is more or less a weighted average of all of the combined stringency, or all of the combined non-pharmaceutical interventions. So then it was like, great, first step done. Now we needed to predict COVID-19. So to do this, we created an implementation of the Imperial College Flaxman model. This is an SEIR model, which is kind of common in epidemiological studies. And we did our own implementation for two big reasons. First, because we needed to have predictions that went out months and years rather than just weeks or maybe months, because clinical trials run on the longer time scale. And the other reason was we wanted to do our predictions based off of specific scenarios rather than trying to predict what the government was most likely to do, because we're not political scientists and it's a little bit hard to decide what any government is going to do. So instead, we used scenarios. So the scenarios that we looked at were three different scenarios. The first being the most relaxed government intervention. So this is complete unlocking, pretending to go back to January 2020, where we didn't have any of these sorts of interventions. The next was going to the government's most stringent that they ever were. So this is to go to a country's maximum, whatever the countries had at the height of their lockdown, that's what you would go back and you'd keep locked for the next 2 years, till 2022. And finally, the final one we looked at was a reactive scenario. So this is a scenario where we would kind of lock and go to an unlock state based off of the number of daily deaths. And for the most part, we used 1 death per million as a threshold to go forward. So with these 3 different predictions of future NPIs and thus the deaths from those future NPIs, we were able to go forward onto the next step in our data science workflow, which was to take all the information we had, both the external and internal sources, in order to create a model-ready data set. So this model-ready data set took information from the COVID-19 statistics, the NPI information that we had that was actually the actual NPI information, along with future predictions of COVID-19 deaths, cases, and NPIs, and the recruitment information that we had from our internal sources, and most importantly, pre-COVID-19 COVID recruitment plans. So then once we had all of this information together, we could move on to the modeling. Well, first we had to pull it all together. And to pull it together, we had to do a bunch of data standardization and data transformation. There was a lot of different kind of small differences between a lot of these data sets. Some of them had different country names and they had different approaches to missing. And once we did the data standardization we needed to and the transformation, then we were able to move on to the model. The main question that the model was trying to answer is how much of the planned versus actual gap was explained by COVID-19. And so in order to do this, we took 22 studies in order to pilot this thing that go across 49 different countries and had then this Poisson gamma model, which is in order to predict the recruitment process. So this model is made up of 3 different smaller processes, which is site initiation, screening, and randomization. And that's because they're all interdependent. You can't randomize a subject until they've been screened, and you can't screen subjects until you have a site. So each one of these processes has its own very specific rate. So how our model works basically is we would assume that the actual rate equaled the planned rate times some multiplier. So for instance, if your multiplier was 0.5, your screening rate with a multiplier of 0.5 means that you're actually screening half of what you plan to screen. So then we'd made the multipliers dependent on these COVID-19 metrics, such as the cases, deaths, and stringency index, and with the goal of creating a model that would be able to get recruitment milestones such as last subject, last visit. So once we had these estimates of the multipliers that varied over time, we could then make the predictions of using the future pandemic scenarios that I was talking about before. So you could make the restrictions for no restrictions, maximal, and then the cyclic one. With the predictions around future recruitment, we were able to get a percentile-based estimate of achieving recruitment milestones. So for instance, teams would be able to say something like, we can be 80% confident that we'll achieve 50% recruitment by August 2021. So this is all great. Now we have all of that stuff together, and you end up with multipliers that look something like this. So where your orange dots are your pre-COVID-19 multipliers. So for the studies we had pre-COVID-19, we were doing fairly well. Actually, we tend to do better than we planned on doing. But since COVID-19, as you can imagine, the screening rate has dropped for all of these studies, all of these countries, and some more significantly than the others. So once we have all of this information, we now have COVID-19 predictions, we have recruitment predictions, we have all of this internal and external data source into a big giant data set. We were able to create an interactive visualization. So this shiny app looks something like this. Study teams come in, they select their protocol number, and then whatever scenarios they want to be looking for. Then they're able to look at one of 2 frames. Either they can look at country level specific information with specific measurements into recruitment, or they can be looking at the milestone predictions where the focus is on the last subject first visit, because when consulting with the study teams, that was the thing they cared about the most. So here are these density strips where the darker the color, the more likely that day is last subject first visit for that study and that scenario. And below this is a table. And this table allows study teams to select how confident they want to be in their particular date. Maybe they are a very early phase study and they're very early on in the process, and so they want to be more confident, and they might choose to use for instance, 95% probability of reaching last subject, last visit. Or they might be less risk averse and go for something more like 75% confident of reaching last subject, last visit. So what teams have done is they 75 seems to be the favorite number that we've heard so far, is look at this number and say, okay, for the scenario where there's we go back to the maximum scenario, so all countries, all max, we are 75% confident, given the data that we have, that we'll achieve last subject, last visit by April 10th, 2022. And so this date has been able to be brought to governance boards, and unlike the typical dates they see, it actually does have a certain amount of confidence behind it, and they understand with the probability how likely that date it is to achieve that date. So it's even better key than usually what they have, which is just a single date value without any confidence interval around it. So that's been able to be used. So that was all great, and it was very exciting, but we ran across one problem, which was that because we were using a single large data set, it was quite slow and dependent on the object store where that data set lived. So the process would be to open the app would take a long time to load. Once it finally loaded, then it would be fine to use. But because of that dependency on the object store and the time to copy, it just didn't feel like a very viable long-term product. So what we decided to do was convert it into a database that would then be used for the Shiny app. So the first thing we had to do was to do some data normalization. As you can see from kind of the spider web of the data model that we have, it's a bit messy. We have a lot of different data that kind of varies at different speeds. For instance, your COVID statistics, like your deaths, they vary by date and by country, but they don't vary by study. Other things like the screening rate, the planned screening rate, will vary by study and country, but doesn't actually vary over time. So with all of this stuff together, we were into a nice SQLite database. We were then able to have a system that works now much more like this, where once you're in the app, a study team selects which protocol they want and what they're particularly interested in. A query goes into the database. The data SQL engine is able to pull back this very specific data, and we went from having a rather slow app to a much faster one, which was great for all concerned. And then we ran into another problem, because that's how it happens when you're building complex systems like this, which is that we oftentimes wouldn't find problems until the very end. A lot of the problems that we had were things that were easier to find when you looked at them rather than when you looked at the plots altogether rather than looking at any one specific part. So some of the common problems we had were things like lacking predictions altogether or non-monotonic predictions for things that were supposed to be cumulative. And all of these errors could be detected by queries, but we didn't actually have enough tests running on the data. So we had to write a lot of tests. And so we spent a lot of time in making sure we had enough infrastructure in those tests. And another thing that we did is we made sure that we had testing throughout the process rather than just at the end or just at the beginning. So it converted our process to something that looks a little bit more like this, where we have internal data and the internal and external data. We do a bunch of data wrangling and we put that into a database, and then that database goes up to the predictive modeling, where you get and then as soon as the modeling is done, it goes back into the database with testing done at each step of the process. And finally, a snapshot of that database is taken to use for the visualization, so that we can always know where things came from. And so that is basically where we are today. And there were definitely two key factors for being able to produce this and to make such a success of this project. The first one was the people. We had a fairly small team, but it was a really diverse experience. And we were in constant communications with frequent stand-ups and a very agile mindset that allowed us to get things done quickly. And we used things like a GitHub and things like that to have shared code bases, so that if somebody went on holiday or something like that, there was always somebody to cover, which turned out to be just a really important tool also to catch mistakes, because we always saw what the other person was doing. So if something didn't hold up logically, we could talk about it. Another thing that was really important was just the tools and packages that already existed. We spent less time trying to make new things that would solve this very big problem, and more time applying existing tools and existing packages to the problem that we had. So all of our data, wrangling and things like that were done using the tidyverse packages, and we use the assert R package to do a lot of our testing. We use Stan to do most of our modeling, and we use pretty common data engineering things like SQLite and PostgreSQL in order to do this, our data engineering and data storage. And finally, then we had the visualization, which was done using mostly ggplot and Plotly and within our Shiny app. And so all of this started kind of late April, and we had a full release at the beginning of August. This is still just a pilot release, so there's only 22 studies, but we are working to expand to all of the studies we have here at GSK. And it's been a very long and exciting journey, but it wasn't always easy, and there were definitely slip-ups that we had along the way. Just in summary, we managed to create a tool that in 5 months that teams have been able to use to replan studies and bring these replans to governance boards by having a multidisciplinary team with statisticians and data scientists and the support of clinical operations professionals in order to make it. And it was largely built on well-developed and existing technology. Things like the SEIR model and the Poisson Gamma model are common in epidemiology and the recruitment predictions, respectively. And equally, the SQL databases that we used and the Shiny app that we created all were built on common, well-understood technology. And so we were able to create this innovation by leveraging all of this existing technology. And yeah, that's all I have. Yeah, that I think it's been a really intense 5 months, but it's been really good.
All right. Well, thank you, Christina, for sharing your experience and how you guys build a tool. We do have a few questions in the chat, and I think one that has been asked by Bella has already been answered by one of your colleagues. So we'll move to the next one, which comes from Crystal Slattery, and she's asking, did you compare your models for COVID-19 against historical record of planned versus actual recruitment for past trials? In my experience, recruitment planning or prediction is notoriously poor in general.
Yeah, so we are still in the process of looking at the predictions that we've done compared to how the models are actually, or basically how recruitment's actually performing, because our model is more looking at kind of the gap between the planned and the actuals. We can look at our predictions in kind of the COVID times, but it's not very easy to apply the model to basically times before COVID, because it does take in these multipliers and it's based off of stringency index and things like that. So we haven't looked in the past, but we are undergoing that process now to kind of reflecting and seeing how much our predictions are reflective of what people are seeing as we're going forward in time.
All right, thank you, Christina. We have room for another question, and I think Adam's question is being handled by Magda. Thank you so much for helping Christina in the chat. We have a question from Michael, who is asking, how big was the team who put the solution together?
Oh, there were 11 people. Let's see. I can't count. Yeah, there's, scroll back to the very beginning. Yeah, about 11 people, I would say.
Wow, that's pretty impressive piece of work for a team of 11 people.
Yep, exactly 11. So yeah, and some of it was also really good to have. Because we had buy-in from the leadership team quite early on, it meant that all of us were able to basically be pulled off completely all of our projects and devote 100% of our time to this. And without that buy-in and without kind of that ability to be free to do one thing, we probably wouldn't have been able to get this done.
Yeah, I'm sure we can all relate to that. So I'm glad it was that kind of moved you guys into the project and helped you to move fast with it. But we're at 11:20, perfect time. And thank you so much, Christina. Thank you for coming and giving us a presentation.
Thank you.